بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا وحبيبنا ومولانا محمد الصادق الأمين المبعوث رحمة للعالمين، وعلى آله الطاهرين الطيبين، وعلى أصحابه أجمعين، وعلى أزواجه أمهات المؤمنين، وعلى ذريته إلى يوم الدين. سبحانك اللهم لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا، وزدنا اللهم علما وعملا متقبلا، آمين يا رب العالمين. أخبرنا بمتن رسالة نخبة الفكر في مصطلح أهل الأثر لأمير المؤمنين في الحديث الحافظ محمد بن علي بن محمد بن حجر العسقلاني رحمه الله، علامة حمص المحمية ووليها شيخ المجيز العلامة المربي سيدي الشيخ محمد سعيد الكحيل الحمصي الشاذلي النقشبندي رحمه الله تعالى، بقراءة عليه كاملة في داره بحمص. So this was the first reading that I did of Nukhbat al-Fikar, was with the Sufi Sheikh of Hims, and he was a Naqshbandi Shazili, and a great Sheikh indeed, full of light and well respected by all, and he wielded immense authority in Homs. Sheikh Muhammad Sa'id al-Kahil rahimahullah, he passed away, and I read it myself to him from beginning to end in his house in Homs. So in English and in colloquial Arabic we say Homs, but when we pronounce it in Fusha we must say Hims. And that reading was with a group of various scholars and students, and my son Fouad was there also, and our friend the erudite Sheikh Dr. Muhammad Munir al-Haik al-Himsi, who is now living in Damascus. And that reading was transmitted with the Sheikh Muhammad Sa'id al-Kahil's own reading with his Sheikh. So, thank you. And his Sheikh was Al-Hafiz, the Hadith Master, Ahmad ibn Muhammad ibn Siddiq al-Maghribi al-Ghumari, rahimahullah ta'ala. The great Hafiz Ahmad al-Ghumari, you may have heard his name before, with his chains to Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani. And he mentioned several chains that he has to Ibn Hajar in his Thabat, yani the catalogue of his teachers. Thabat, we call that, not to be confused with Thabat. Thabat, and it's called Al-Bahr al-Amiq fi Marwiyat Ibn al-Siddiq. It's in print, I think 2 volumes. كما أخبرني بها أستاذي المجيز الطبيب الفقيه المحدث الجامع للقراءات العشر الدكتور محمد سامر النص حفظه الله. I also did a second reading, another reading with another teacher, the teacher of Quran in Damascus, and he's a faqih in Hanafi mazhab and a muhaddith as well, Dr. Samir al-Nas, بقراءة عليه كاملة مع الشرح الوجيز في داره بدمشق, in his house in Damascus with my reading. So both of the times I was reading and they were commenting. عن محقق طبعة النخبة مجيزنا وأستاذنا المبجل السيد الحافظ الدكتور نور الدين عيتر حفظه الله. And Dr. Samir himself did his reading with Dr. Nur al-Din Aitr, who is also one of my sheikhs, but I did not read that with Dr. Nur al-Din Aitr. Dr. Nur al-Din Aitr gave me ijaza, but I read it with Dr. Samir al-Nas, who himself read it with Dr. Nuruddin. And in Hadith science, this gives me as if I read it with Dr. Nuruddin Haider. You see? Because I read it with someone who read it with Dr. Nuruddin Haider, and Dr. Nuruddin Haider gave me ijaza, so it's as if I narrate it with reading from Dr. Nuruddin Haider, who is the editor of this edition. And this is the second edition, actually. And a gift of Shaykh Nuruddin, as you see here in the page before the title page, it says Hadiyat al-Muhaqqiq, and a gift of the editor. And I asked him to write me something. He just signed his initials or something. Nuruddin, mashallah, may Allah preserve him, grant him long life and good health. And he himself read it with his uncle and his father-in-law, his maternal uncle and father-in-law, Shaykh al-Islam al-Hafiz al-Mufassir al-Sayyid Abi Najib Abdullah Siraj al-Din al-Halabi, the wali of Aleppo, whom Maulana Shaykh Nazim visited more than once. عن شيخه الشيخ إبراهيم الختني المدني بسنده إلى الحافظ ابن حجر, from his Shaykh Ibrahim Khutani of Medina al-Munawwara, with al-Khutani's chain back to Ibn Hajar. So these are my chains of transmission for this primer on Hadith science. And without further ado, we begin with the words of Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani. Did anyone bring the translation with them by any chance? Yeah, good. So you can double check and maybe correct me. He said, وبسند إلى الإمام الحافظ أمير المؤمنين في الحديث ابن حجر العسقلاني, by the word in the beginning. So that's why we know that we can also say not just Nawawi but Nawawi, because it comes from Nawa, because تدريب الراوي في شرح تدريب الراوي في شرح book by Nawawi. That the book by Suyuti, Tadrib al-Rawi, is originally a commentary on a book by Nawawi. And so when you read it like that, you have to pronounce it in that way if you read the full title of Tadrib al-Rawi. This is, and Nukhbat al-Fikar is like the choicest thoughts. So Fikar is the plural of Fikra, thought. And Nukhba is like Muntakhab, we said selected. So choicest thoughts on the nomenclature, Mustalah, or terminology of the people of Athar. And Athar means specifically reports transmitted from people before. And in its specific usage, it can mean hadith, or saying of a companion, or saying of a tabi, the next generation. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi alladhi lam yazal aliman qadira. So for the sake of time, because we have into English most of the time. Glory to Allah, who without beginning was always all-knowing and almighty. And blessings of Allah on our liege Lord Muhammad, whom He sent to people. And there is one version that says ila nasi kaffatan, not just ila nas, to people, all of them, without exception, as a bringer of glad tidings, bashiran, and as a warner, wa nadhiran, and upon the the family of Muhammad and his companions, and bless and greet him with an abundant greeting of peace. To proceed, truly compilations, books that concern the nomenclature or the terminology of the scholars of hadith are many. And there are some that are long, there are some that are abridgments. One of the brothers asked me to summarize for him the most important or salient points of that literature. And I responded to his request, hoping to be included into those, meaning those lofty masalik. So masalik comes from, it's a plural of maslak, which comes from salaka, which is the verb which is at the root of suluk, so wayfaring. So masalik is those paths of scholarship, meaning that august assembly of scholars. So if I write something that has to do with that literature, perhaps I will be remembered the way that they are remembered as pioneers or as helpers of knowledge in that specific discipline. And so I say the report, al-khabar. You know, like the Malays and the Indonesians say apa khabar. It's originally an Arabic word. So what's news? How are you? And so khabar exists in other languages. I'm sure it exists in Urdu, Persian as well, and all of the Arabic mixed languages of Islam. And it means report, news. And here in particularly it's a report. The report either has many paths, meaning paths of transmission, without a specific number, or with confined أو مع حصر بما فوق الاثنين, or with a specific number but above 2 paths of transmission, or with only 2 paths of transmission, or with only a single path of transmission. So there are 4 categories, right? Unlimited, with limited but above 2, and then with only 2 paths of transmission, and then with only 1 path. How many paths of transmission do I have for this book? From what I just told you, 2, right? Because I read it through 2 teachers, like that. فالأول, so the first type, the one that is unlimited paths, is known as al-mutawatir. Al-mutawatir, the mass transmitted. So for example, Imam Abu Hanifa, we mentioned this report before. He said, I did not include the ruling on wiping on the khuf until I was absolutely sure of it, like I'm sure of the sun on a cloudless day being in the middle of the sky at noon. Why? Because it's narrated through from the Prophet ﷺ through more than 70 companions. This is mass transmission, like that. More than 70 of them narrate, and 70 is a huge number, and so that's mass transmission. That the Prophet ﷺ wiped on the khufs without removing them every time to wash the feet as part of wudu. So wiping on the khuf is a valid wudu, and it's the sunnah of our Prophet ﷺ. If you do not do it because you don't consider it valid, then you are not following the sunnah of the Holy Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. As simple as that. And the mass transmission is something that you don't even have to think about in order to accept, because there's just too many people reporting it. Like we gave the example of China. Don't have to go there to verify that it exists, because there are just too many people from all walks of life telling you about it, and it is something that is perceptible through sensory organs, and it is not something that they could have possibly all collided to lie about. Yeah. So when the mind is satisfied that these criteria are met, and knowledge is established without the shadow of a doubt, and that's what mutawatir conveys, mass transmission. And that's the first type. المفيد للعلم اليقيني بشروطه. So the first type is the mutawatir, the mass transmitted report, which intimates, or which teaches you or gives you or informs you with knowledge that is absolutely certain, yaqeen, ilmul yaqeen, with its preconditions. We mentioned them. And the second type is called al-mashhur, the famous, the widespread report. In other words, it is above two paths of transmission, but it is limited. It does not reach to mass transmission, but it borders it. And that's called the famous report, and it's mashhur, and it is also called وَهُوَ الْمُسْتَفِيدُ عَلَى رَأْيٍ. There is one opinion that says it is the Mustafid report. We mentioned that term Mustafid in the reading of the Nasafiyya. وَالثَّالِثُ الْعَزِيز. So the third type is the rare report, Aziz. So Aziz can have the meaning of rare as it has the meaning of dear and precious. And Azizun alayhi ma'anittum, it weighs heavily on the Prophet ﷺ what you are enduring of suffering. That's at the end of Surah At-Tawbah, Surah number 9. And Allah says Azizun alayhi, so that can also mean, it also comes from Izzah, power, weighing powerfully. And also Aziz is someone who does not need others, mighty and powerful, Al-Aziz Jalla Jalalu. And they are the attributes of majesty and loftiness and transcendence. And when we say the Al-Aziz, Al-Hamid, Al-Muta'al, Al-Ali, Al-Azim, all of these, Al-Quddus, Al-Subuh. Okay. Here it means rare report. So it comes only through two paths. وَلَيْسَ شَرْطًا لِلصَّحِيحِ خِلَافًا لِمَنْ زَعَمَهُ. And it is not a precondition for a Sahih report to have two paths of transmission at least, as claimed by some people. So he refers by that to some Mu'tazilis or some people of some scholars of the Hanafi mazhab who chose that view, that a report has to have at least two paths of transmission. But it's nice to have two paths of transmission. I try to read the books that I read with my teachers, that I read with my teachers. I try to always find a second teacher always for each book that I read. There is something naturally it's satisfying to read the same thing from a different perspective, a different scholar. It minimizes the mistakes in your own understanding, inshallah. So, of course, the more pairs of eyes look at your work, etc. I mean, everyone knows that. Even in production of art or whatever, right? You need ears to hear, and you need people to hear it through other than your own perspective, or the perspective of approval that materialized with the first reading. But a report can be sahih without having two paths of transmissions, which brings us to the fourth type, or Rabi'u, al-gharib, the odd. Al-gharib in the sense of odd, not in the sense of strange, because that's also a word for strange. Islam began as gharib, as stranger, and shall become gharib again. Blessed be the strangers. Tuba lil ghuraba, plural. So al-gharib here means the rare, more than rare. The odd, the single chained would be the best way to translate it. وَكُلُّهَا سِوَى الْأَوَّلِ, and all of them except the first one, meaning the mass transmitted, are called ahad. Ahad, plural of ahad. It sounds familiar, right? So ahad means lone transmitted. Lone transmitted doesn't mean necessarily single chained, but lone transmitted means they are countable on the fingers of the hand, those who transmit them. Whereas when it reaches something like above 10, it's beyond the fingers of the hand, right? So we call those ones that fall below the tawatur category, all of them, we call them lone transmitted reports. Ahad. وَفِيهَا, meaning among the ahad reports, the non-transmitted ones. Now we're talking about all the reports except the mass transmitted ones. And so among the lone transmitted ones, there is the accepted reports, the rejected reports, because seeking a proof from through them hinges upon the research about the states of the narrators, as opposed to the first type. As I said before, the first type, the mass transmitted one, you accept with your eyes closed. You don't need to check the identity of who told you that China exists one by one by one by one. And you know what kind of veracity they have, what kind of moral fiber they have, and do they lie in their lives, etc. No, but any other than that kind of report, you have to verify that painstakingly, and that's what the narrators of hadith did. So the science of hadith is very biographical in nature and historical. It's like truth in reporting. You need to do some investigative work in order to trace back the report to its purported source, to its claimed alleged source. And the hadith masters were, truth oriented and truth in reporting before the letter, before that term became famous in our journalistic age. Because we're talking here about your life, the life of your soul, your deepest belief, your spiritual identity, and as a believer in God and the last day. So this is very important. And then he says that there might befall in such reports, meaning the non-mass transmitted ones, what intimates and informs you of knowledge as well, meaning ironclad information, knowledge. Well, that's what we call knowledge. Has to be something that worthy of that name. So we know that mass transmitted reports convey absolute certain knowledge, right? That it cannot possibly be untrue. But all the others, they do not. But they can rise to the level of knowledge. What kind of knowledge? Nazari knowledge, yani intellective knowledge, and deductive knowledge. بالقرائن النظري بالقرائن, يعني through external indicators. And for example, when there's just a large number of those lone narrated reports, they come through so many different chains, each chain falling short of mass transmission. Or the chains altogether, they do not amount to mass transmission, because the reports, the wording differ too much, so it cannot be said to be a single report. But there's it adds to the picture of truth around this saying having taken place. Or it took place in different wordings at different times, but therefore the general gist of it becomes almost mass transmitted, you see. So that's what they mean by now ilm with an-nazari bil-qara'in, as opposed to ilm al-yaqini as before. And then he says, this said, gharaba, or single chain status or singleness, is either at the is either in the chain itself, meaning there is only one chain, that's it, there is no other chain for that, or other than that. So the first type is called the absolute fard, yani the absolute unique specimen. And the second type is called the relative fard, relatively unique. Okay. And the second type is seldom or rarely called unique. For example, the chain, at each level of the chain there is only one narrator, but that's the absolute unique report. But there are other reports where there is one narrator at the first level from the Prophet, there is one Sahabi only who narrates it, there is one Tabi'i who narrates from that Sahabi, but after that it branches out. There is many. So that's a relatively unique chained report. Relatively only, because only part of the chain is unique. And the rest, after that, it branches out into several chains. That's what he means by al-fard al-nisbi. And then the report of lone narrated hadiths that are conveyed by an upright narrator, meaning moral fiber, moral character, upright, adl, tam al-dabt, who is extremely meticulous So now we're talking about technique of reporting and word for word memorization, conveyance. They understand that what the difference between verbatim and vaguely in that sense. So this one is verbatim and meticulously transmitting, muttasil as-sanad, with a non-broken chain, with an integral chain of transmission, without any broken links. غير معلل ولا شاذ, without any hidden defect and without anomaly. Because all of these criteria might be met, but there is an anomaly in it. شاذ. There's something wrong somewhere. It's not in the chain of transmission. It might be in the content. Right. So if none of those defects are found, then هو الصحيح لذاته. It is the sound, or also translated as rigorously authentic. That's what we mean in Arabic when we say as-sahih لذاته, in itself. Does not need any additional proof outside it to be called sahih. Now, its rank varies. Its rank might fall short of that when there is one or more of these preconditions that you just named that are missing. But when they are all met, then it is sahih in itself. So, from that perspective, we put first the compilation of Sahih al-Bukhari. He is the one that in the Ummah, the whole Ummah has been seen to meet that high criteria, the most of all compilations in his book, Imam Bukhari. So it is put first in the Ummah, among all the books of Hadith. ثم Muslim, then Sahih Muslim, his student, Muslim ibn al-Hajjaj. And both of them were operating in the arena of Naysabur, around Naysabur. That's where Muslim came from. That's where Imam Bukhari achieved his fame. But he came from originally Bukhara, and he died in Tashkent, right, near Samarkand, Bukhara, that area of Central Asia. So that whole area was called Khurasan, and we said before that Khurasan was one of the huge arenas of Islamic knowledge at that time, in the 2nd to 4th century, and even up to the 5th century. طيب. Then ثم شرطهما, then their criteria of Sahih Bukhari and Muslim, whoever meets that. So when meticulousness and accuracy, precision is less, then we call it the fair report in itself. We do not no longer call it the sound report, fair report, or merely authentic, not rigorously authentic in itself. So when you have many fair reports in themselves, or many fair chains in themselves, the chains of transmission, they are all fair and they're conveying the same report, that report becomes sahih, not in itself, sahih collectively, through its collective chains. It's not the same as a sahih in itself, right? See the hierarchy here of authenticity. And فَإِن جُمِعَ, so when we say that a report is both Hasan and Sahih, like Imam Tirmidhi has this habit, and many scholars stop there. What does he mean exactly? Why he says Hasan Sahih? He does not say just Hasan or just Sahih. What does he mean by Hasan Sahih? So he says when they are brought together, either it means that there is hesitation in the compiler or the transmitter as to which one applies. Why? Because there is hesitation as to the singleness of the report. And does it have indeed more chains or less chains? So it vacillates between more and less. So you say Hasan or Sahih, it could be either one of the two. The important thing is that it is authentic. وَإِلَّا فَبِاعْتِبَارِ إِسْنَادَيْنِ, or else it could be because we are looking at two distinct chains, one of them being Hasan chain, one of them being Sahih chain. And so the reports that these two chains convey is, we grade it Hasan Sahih, regarding, depending on through which perspective or what chain we are looking at it. And again, the important thing is that it is authentic. So these are, when it comes to authenticity itself, generically, it's a moot point, to know which is it, Hasan or Sahih. It's authentic. فإن نعم وزيادة راويهما مقبولة. Now, if one narrator adds something that is not found in another chain or another version of that same hadith, such an addition is accepted as long as it does not just contradict the conveyance through someone who is more trustworthy than that narrator. And we know that the levels of trustworthiness will come up later when we discuss the narrators themselves. Now, if it is contradicted with something that is preponderant or that is more weightier in authenticity or in convincing status, then we keep the preponderant version either of the chain or of the report, and we call that al-mahfuz, the preserved version, mahfuz. And opposite that is the shadh, the anomalous version, or the so what do you have, the aberrant version?
He has stronger, the well-preserved is mahfuz, and its opposite is the anomalous report, shadh.
Yes, so the well-preserved versus the anomalous, mahfuz and shadh. And if in addition to that we have weakness in the narrator, then instead of saying well-preserved for the preponderant version, we will call it al-ma'ruf, the well-known. And its opposite is al-munkar, the disclaimed one. So disclaimed is a shaz that comes through a weak narrator. And the ma'ruf is a mahfuz that comes through a weak narrator again. Time. Now the relative unique report or chain, if it is congruent with another, we call that other, or we call it itself, either one, we call it the mutabi'. Mutabi', what do we have? Corroborant. Corroborant. So the corroborant, and that's great because corroborants come in between two weak hadiths, for example, two weak chains, they corroborate one another. So they are upgraded through that. Corroborants are like a sub-branch of this discipline that are extremely useful to not to throw out the baby with the bathwater, as you say, and not to just cull the whole thing and say because there is weakness. And no, weakness doesn't mean you discard it. Weakness doesn't mean lie. Weakness doesn't mean forgery. It just means that those narrators are just not of the same rank as the great meticulous ones, as the super memorizers, like people like Bukhari, Muslim, Tirmizi, Imam Shafi, and that sort. They were exceptional people. They were people who had photographic memory. Not everyone has that. So there are others also who had upright, very upright characters, maybe even more than them, but they did not have that same care for meticulousness, and they had other maybe strengths, but not in that time. So weak doesn't mean forget him, forget that. No, you must be very careful about that. That's the science of corroborants, mutabi'. Now, if you find a text as opposed to the chain now, before we're discussing chains and narrators, but now if we find a matan, a text that resembles it, we call that text the shahid, the witness report. Okay, so for example, one text says let us say that Zamzam is for what it is drunk for, and another text says Zamzam is for whatever request or petition or prayer it is done for. Or Zamzam fulfills instead of is. Because Zamzam lima shuriba lahu. Or Zamzam lima du'ya. Or I'm not saying that such a hadith exists, but this would be a case where the difference is purely in the text. So the texts sometimes have a slightly different meaning that confirms the hadith you are working on. So these are not called corroborant, because corroborant we reserve mutabi' for the chain itself or the narrator, but these are witness texts, witness reports that tell you that yes, this has a basis of authenticity, a stronger basis than you would think if you just looked at that one in isolation of the other. And وَتَتَبُّعُ الطُّرُقِ لِذَلِكَ. Now when you examine different and research different chains through those two aspects of corroborants and witness reports, that activity is called al-i'tibar. Al-i'tibar, consideration. I'tabara, ibra. From that we get ibra, lesson. But it comes also from the vision, insight, consideration of something for the purpose of study and perusal, all of that. So that's why they say sometimes this hadith is good for i'tibar. This hadith serves for perusal, for because it will buttress your search for a mutabi'a or a shahid. And this is said almost exclusively for weak hadiths. صالح للاعتبار, يعني fit for perusal and consideration. ثم المقبول. Now accepted reports, if they are without contest, we call that the muhkam. يعني what do you have?
It is free from contradiction or objection. المعارضة. He says that which is accepted is maqbul.
The muhkam
is decisive. Sorry.
Decisive. Yes. Decisive. Not open to interpretation anymore. Not in need of research. Not muhkam. It's established. Now it's close to what we said before of yaqeen, but here it just means that muhkam in the sense that it is established as authentic. It has a strong basis of authenticity. Now, if it is contradicted, or if there is something opposing it of the same rank of authenticity, bimithlihi, same. Mithl is same. Nahu is similar. So mithl is the strongest term of similarity or comparison. And I translate it as a rule as identical. Now, if it is possible to reconcile the two, we call that activity mukhtalif al-hadith, the art of reconciling superficially contradictory hadiths. And this is beautiful. You have also that activity even in tafsir of Quran. For example, we mentioned that before, that Allah said that you do not guide those whom you love. Allah guides whoever He wishes. And in another verse says, truly you guide to Sirat al-Mustaqim, or to the right path. So someone will come and say, well, which is it? Is the Prophet ﷺ, is he guiding? Or no, he's not guiding, only Allah guides, because we find both statements in the Holy Quran. And we explain that there is two types of guidance: the guidance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is the guidance of inspiration to the heart and of granting tawfiq, success in dunya towards akhirah, yani the success of belief, that spontaneity, the one that Sayyidina Abu Bakr as-Siddiq had, the highest among non-prophets in this ummah, and the one that Abu Lahab lacked, even though he was a relative of the Prophet ﷺ, more fit in apparent terms through blood to believe, but yet he did not believe. So he did not have that inspiration nor that tawfiq, the success that Allah gives. However, the guidance that the Prophet ﷺ gives is the guidance of irshad, of leading, guiding, in the sense of educating and training, and the guidance of istidlal, yani providing the proofs and teaching the proofs, explaining them, elaborating them and elucidating them, proofs of Quran and of Hadith, the proof of inspiration, the proofs of heavenly revelation of all the books comes through the prism of the Prophet ﷺ, and that is pure guidance and 100% guidance. So see, both guidances, one that Prophet ﷺ was singled out to provide, and one that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala only holds in his hand subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that is the reconciliation of apparently contradictory verses. And the hadith, also there is a whole literature of that, mukhtalif al-hadith you call it, awla. And so if it is irreconcilable, and we know that there is a version that is historically later than the previous one, like for example, do not visit graves, and then another hadith says visit graves. Well, we know for sure that the second one comes later, because another version of the second one says, I had told you before not to visit graves. So inside the version of the second hadith itself, there is the historical pointer to what we call abrogation of the ruling that came before. And this is very convenient, but oftentimes that is not present in the wording of the abrogator text. And that also applies again in the verses of Quran. There are some that tell you, like, for example, you in آمن الرسول يعني الله ما في السماوات والأرض إن تبدوا ما في أنفسكم أو تخفوه يحاسبكم به الله. And whether you reveal what is in your soul and conscience or not, Allah will judge you concerning it. The companion said, who can escape the judgment of Allah concerning what is hidden deep inside that? Because we are prone to, bad thoughts sometimes and so forth. So they came to the Prophet ﷺ, and then Allah revealed, رَبَّنَا لَا تُؤَاخِذْنَا بِمَا نَسِينَا رَبَّنَا وَلَا تُحَمِّلْنَا مَا لَا طَاقَةَ لَنَا بِهِ, which abrogates the one that comes right before. So we still recite the one that comes right before, and we still say, Allah shall judge you about it, but at the same time Allah is saying right after that that He will not task you beyond your capacity, and He will not take you to task for what escapes your strength. So that was a reassurance. And the Prophet ﷺ said, Allah said this after you complain, it was a balm on their hearts, and that is an abrogation of the previous criteria, mashallah. You see, so and in hadith as well. So now, in hadith, that's the science of knowing which report comes later. That gives you a pointer towards abrogation if there is, you are trying to solve the problem of contradiction. Right. So if we know that, he says, then through knowing which one comes last, and we call it then abrogator, and the other one the abrogated. Otherwise, then we فالترجيح, we just say that one is preponderant over the other. They have the same level of authenticity, so it's not a question of preponderance in authenticity, but rather of general preponderance through what we know generally of the Sharia, that one will be preponderant over the other. And otherwise, we stop short of putting it into practice, tawakkuf, right? And usually we call that the discrepant hadith, discrepant, and there is discrepancy because there is apparent mutual contradiction here. So we don't know which one really is the strong and authentic one. So then the rejected hadith is either because there is a gap or there is an aspersion. Now the gap is either at the beginning of the portion of the chain closest to the compiler. Yani I did not hear it from Maulana Shaykh, I did not hear it from Maulana Shaykh Nazim or from Maulana Shaykh Hisham. I cannot say that I heard it from Grand Shaykh, but I am reporting it from Grand Shaykh. There is a gap there. There is a gap. And in our cases, a very unlikely gap. It just the only way to excuse that is to say, I don't remember if I heard it from Maulana Shaykh Hisham or from Maulana Shaykh Nazim or from another one of the contemporaries of Maulana Grand Shaykh. But to say, no, I did not hear it from any of the contemporaries. I heard it from Grand Shaykh directly. Anyone with an iota of historical perception will know that that can't be. But in later generations, if that text of mine survived, they might be confused about it. They might think, oh, maybe he did live in his time. They will not know. They will have no idea unless they research, right? But this nobody who's claiming to have narrated from. So it's the same with hadith from the Prophet. So you have to know, is he a Sahabi or a Tabi'i? Okay. So now the gap, either the Sahabi or Tabi'i, that would be from the at the end of the sanad, the top of the sanad. But we're talking here about the beginning of the sanad at the bottom, meaning the compiler that is closest to him, who's narrating from. There is a gap right there. So if there is such a gap, or from the end after the Tabi'i, there is a gap after the Tabi'i, yani the companion is missing, the companion link is missing, or other than that. So now we call the first type the suspended chain, mu'allaq, and the second type the mursal chain, missing the companion. Okay, and the mursal means dispatched or expedited chain. Like, for example, Hasan al-Basri said the Prophet ﷺ said. Muhammad ibn Sirin said the Prophet ﷺ said. Right? Makhul said, Mujahid said, all of these great tabi'is, without mentioning the companion. So these are mursal reports. Now, by definition, these are weak, and then we need to really strengthen them through different criteria. والثالث, the third type, if there is two gaps and more, if they are successive, we call that the mu'dal. What's mu'dal? Problematic. Otherwise, it's simply broken chain, right? Munqati', broken chain. So we reserve broken chain, munqati' for more than one gap in the chain. And if those two gaps are successive, we call that mu'dal. But the mu'dal is also a kind of a broken chain, obviously. They are all, mursal also is broken chain, but because it is a specific link that is easily repairable, or the most easily repairable gap, the Sahabi gap, then we want to name it in a specific way, because we have special ways to deal with that are easier than to deal with a mu'dal, problematic, or a broken chain one in other places in the chain. Then it can be either clear or hidden, meaning that gap, even the mursal, can be hidden. We might think that, like for example, Ibn Abbas, many of these reports are through senior companions, but it doesn't always mention them. But this is a very forgivable gap, and it is really an irrelevant gap in the science of hadith, because it is a companion who is not named there, and Ibn Abbas is also a companion, and he narrates this through a senior companion, so it doesn't harm the chain at all, because to know that it is through a companion, even if he is unnamed, doesn't matter. If it is an unnamed tabi'i, then we have to know who is, because tabi'is are liable to be called weak or fabricators and so forth, but not Sahaba. They are all udul and all reliable. But those Sahaba, some of them, they were junior Sahabas, like Ibn Abbas, narrating in his childhood. So some of the reports he directly witnessed the Prophet ﷺ, and others not directly. And some of those Sahaba are also younger than that also. So they may narrate through a tabi'i who is narrating through another Sahabi. Now here we have to investigate. Okay, so that's called the mursal khafi, yani the unexpected or hidden or concealed dispatched chain. Now, and the first type of the clear gap is easily detectable by realizing that there was no meeting between the two links that are shown as successive in the chain. They belong to two different generation layers. And that's why you need, he's saying, ihtija, you need history, tarikh. And the second, how to detect the second type, you call it the concealment, the concealed gap, المدلس, right? ويرد بصيغة تحتمل اللقي. So that kind of gap in both cases comes up in what wording? In a wording that suggests meeting, as when you say from, right? X from Y from Z said that the Prophet ﷺ said, right? So from, he didn't say X narrated from, X heard Y, or X met Y and Y said to X. No, none of those terms. It just says X from Y. So, well, did they meet? It's possible. So that's what he's saying. It gives a possibility, suggests the possibility of meeting. Or he said, X said that Y said. I said that I say that Einstein said. That doesn't mean I met him, right? So it's not enough for X to simply say Y said in the chain. It's possible that they met, possible that they didn't meet. So I say that Maulana said. I didn't say that I heard him say, but everyone in our time will know that we are contemporaries. So now, if someone in another generation might not know that. Or if I say that Grand Sheikh said. We often do that all the time. We're quoting from any century, right? From any generation layer. So again, you need history to know whether this possible meeting did take place or was even possible, historically speaking. All right. So that's when the chain only has this wording, from or said, he said. Similarly, the hidden mursal from a contemporary that he did not meet. You see, they might be contemporary, but they never met. Subhanallah. So, for example, I spent 9 years in Damascus, but there are shuyukh that lived there and passed away there that I never met. Did not meet every single sheikh worthy of studying with. Some that I wish that I had met, and so. But I can pull the wool over my contemporaries' eyes and say from that sheikh. In reality, I narrate from them through an intermediary, but I conceal that intermediary to give them the impression that I narrate also from him and from her and from mashallah, you sat with so many. But that's tadlis. I'm not exactly lying, but then some kind of tadlis is akin to lying. Like, for example, when the one you are concealing is a weak narrator, so you don't want your chain to be marred or downgraded by the presence of a weak narrator, so you only mention the strong narrators. But then you cannot say anymore, he narrated to me, because you're skipping a link. So you just say from, X from Y. Now, you see? Or X said, Y said. Right, so these are kinds of tadlis, and he will review them later. And a contemporary that they never met, that's a kind of hidden, concealed concealment. A concealed gap. And the reader of the chain might not even realize it's there. And then the other type of reason for rejecting a chain or hadith is aspersion. And that might even either be because the narrator is a liar, or is lying, let's say. Let's not call him a liar, we'll just say that the narrator lies. All right. Or is accused of doing so. All right. Or does chronic mistakes, a chronic number of mistakes, right? Or is heedless of what they narrate. We don't know at times what he's saying, or if he making mistake here or not. Or is corrupt, fisq, or is delusional. Like in later, they might think that they narrated that in Basra from so and so, but they never met him in Basra. That one they met in another country altogether at a different time, and perhaps they are also delusional about exactly what they narrated from there. They mix up the texts and the chains. So delusional, but not because they are chronically indifferent or make chronic mistakes, because they just in that particular point they just don't quite remember well. So they insist that that's what took place. So that's delusional. Or they contradict others who are usually more trustworthy. مخالفة. Or they are just ignorance, jahala. So jahala, ignorance, is also a reason for aspersion of a narrator. Or they are innovators, bid'ah. And innovations, meaning innovations of misguidance, can rank from things that are light in nature and things that are close to unbelief and deep heresy type. Or for poor memory. Now here, poor memory, we need to go back to the commentary of Imam Ibn Hajar on this passage, because poor memory, he does not list that in his commentary, or he lists it as something that does not constitute an aspersion to make the hadith rejected. So this needs pause here. Now, the first type of aspersion, when we call that we say that the narrator is lying, that type of hadith is called the forged hadith, fabricated mawdu'. The second type, the discarded hadith, matruk. The third type, disclaimed according to one opinion. And similarly, the fourth and the fifth type, disclaimed. So you see, there is a difference between forged, between discarded, and between disclaimed. Non-specialists, of course, will have no idea that these categories differ in importance and in gravity. And then, now delusion, al-waham, is detected by looking at external factors and indicators, and by gathering up the paths of transmission. That activity is known as the science of the ilal, the hidden defects of hadith. And that type of hadith that needs that kind of treatment is called the mu'allal, yani the one that contains hidden defects. And then contradiction is either by a change in conveyance, siyaq, and we call that the interpolated chain. Like for example, the Prophet ﷺ said that that the nature of women can be compared to the rib, and the rib that protects the heart, the rib cage, the rib out of which was taken out of Sayyidina Adam's rib cage, and out of which Sayyidah Hawa was created. And he said, now that rib, you men, don't go and try to make it straight. That's the end of it if you do that. And in other words, that you think that you are right, and that the way that you are to set things right, it is to make what Allah created that way, to make it straight according to your criteria of straightness. And then, that's the explanation of the hadith. But then at the end of that hadith, there is a phrase that says, and straightening it, because if you straighten it, you will break it. And there is a phrase that says, and breaking it means divorcing. Now that phrase was never spoken by the Prophet ﷺ. That's the meaning of the hadith. But he didn't speak it. He didn't say it. It was said by Abu Hurairah, the narrator of that hadith. Alright? So if we go and we think that that phrase is, we attribute it to the Prophet ﷺ, we will call that interpolation, mudraj. Mudraj al-hadith. Okay? And if it concerns an additional narrator, then it is a mudraj of isnad. So I gave the example of the second type here, damj mawquf bimarfu', yani by inserting the mawquf, yani the companion's speech, into the prophetic speech. That's mudraj of text. All right. Or but if something that is in a previous position is put last, or something last put first, we call that the maqlub, yani topsy-turvy. Is that what we translated it as? Okay. Yeah. So you will have this version saying this in this order, and this other, but they might be both of them correct. Like for example, mal iman, mal islam, mal ihsan. And the famous version begins with Islam. Mal Islam, mal, yani what is Islam, what is Iman, what is Ihsan, the hadith of Gibril alayhi salam. So some versions have what is Iman first, and then what is Islam. But in that case, it is not a rejected hadith, it is very well established as authentic. But you might have topsy-turvy here. But if the topsy-turvy is in the chain, that this is a grave mistake, because you put the shaykh as narrating from the student, which is not the case. And that happens sometimes when the father narrates from son, so names get confused because it is Muhammad ibn Ahmad ibn Muhammad, and the grandfather also has the same name as the grandson, so then things get confusing here. Or if there is an additional narrator in the chain, then we call this addition in well-connected chains. Or by switching the narrator, and there is no indicator whether which narrator should be put there, and we call that discrepant chain again. Now sometimes that switch might be on purpose to test. They do that temporarily to test a compiler, as they did with Imam Bukhari. They before he arrived in Naisabur, they distributed 100 hadiths among 10 ulama, but they switched the chains around. They took the chain for this hadith, they stuck it to that hadith. They took the chain for that hadith, they put it to the third hadith. They took the chain from that one, like that. They jumbled the chains, but they kept the hadiths and they kept the chains, but all in jumbled order. And each one of them took 10 of these reinvented and now fake chained hadiths of established hadith, and then they dictated them on Bukhari's one by one. The one first scholar read the 10 chains and 10 hadiths, and Bukhari said continue the others, and then they finished and they read 100, and they said, are you finished now? Okay, now the first hadith, the real chain is that one. The second hadith, the real chain should be that one. The third hadith, the real chain should be that one, because those chains were well known to the scholars of that time, and he knew them by heart as if they were right in front of him, like on a band that he just was reading. So at that time they surrendered to his knowledge and said, no, really, he knows his stuff. So that's a case of switching on purpose for the reason of testing. Or it could be that some words, some letters are changed around, but the text itself or the general conveyance stays. So that's a case of the text being tempered or the names being tempered through either tasheef or tahrif. So tasheef is vowelization.
He said dot distorted.
Yeah, dot distortion. So musahaf is dot distorted. Yani instead of having two dots on top, someone wrote two dots under. So it's a ya instead of a ta. The correct form is ta. Like they said, they were saying, is it Bishr or is it Yasir or is it Nasr? And Imam Daraqutni was hearing this and he was in prayer and he said Noon wal qalami wal ma yasturun. Of course, in some mazhab it invalidates the prayer because he is using the recitation inside his prayer to indicate something outside. And I'm sure it was not a fard prayer. At least he would not do that in a fard prayer. Wallahu ta'ala alam. This is so you meant to say to them that it is Nasr and not Bishr and not Yasir. And then the muharraf is the vowel tempered. The vowel tempered. Yani instead of I'll give you an example of that also that our teacher Dr. Wahbi Zuhaili had in class when he mentioned that the dictum saying al-mu'minu kayyisun fatinun, that the mu'min, the believer, is perceptive or is clever, kayyis, and perceptive. Kayyis fatin. They said mukis cotton, and not a bag of cotton. So he did that by changing for kayyis, he changed that to kis. So no letter are changed. So now this is a case of vowel tempering. Kis from kayyis, and that would be tahrif. And fatin becomes qutn by changing the one dot on top of the fa to two dots. It becomes qutn, becomes cotton, and that's dot tempering. So it's a different letter instead of being a different vowel. That's tashif and tahrif. And we know also that the tahrif can be with the meaning itself. As Ibn Abbas said, that the Israelites did tahrif of both the letter and the letter of the text and the spirit of the text, the interpretation of the text, the meaning of the text. طيب. ولا يجوز, and it is not allowed to voluntarily change the texts either by removing something from it or by using a synonym, except for scholars who know what is liable to change the meaning. Because non-scholars might think, oh, this is a good synonym, but boy, you have turned the meaning upside down. That happens all the time when, for example, people try to subtitle talks for YouTube, in their translations and so forth. So the art of translating is really, as they say, the translator is a traitor in many cases. So must be careful. A lot of it is lost in translation, and so that's why here now when you explain, when you mention a hadith, you need to mention it verbatim. That's your duty. Unless you know precisely well what the hadith means deeply, then you may use it for the sake of time, brevity, and so forth. You may use synonyms for it, or refer to it in passing without spelling it out. Now, if the meaning is obscure, you need to explain difficult words, and they call that gharib also. That's another meaning for gharib. And there are so many books of Gharib al-Hadith. It is a whole discipline in itself. Difficult words. There is also Gharib al-Quran, difficult words in Quran. Ibn Qutayba authored great books in both of these disciplines. May Allah be well pleased with him, ad-Dinawari. And he was a great scholar who answered the innovators in his time. So, and he has tafsir and others. Now, Bayan al-Mushkil, and Mushkil is also about obscure. So how did we translate Gharib and Mushkil?
He's translated as for today's unknown jahala. Obscure. Oh wait, I'm sorry, I lost my spot. So he said if the meaning is obscure, explaining odd words and clarifying the problematic is needed.
Yeah. So gharib is odd words, and problematic mushkil. Now we already came across that the mushkil al-hadith yani apparently contradictory, right? So there is a whole science about that. Like Bayan Mushkil al-Athar by Imam Tahawi, big collection, 20 volumes of hadith, and Imam Tahawi was yani probably the apex of that genre he gave with this book, and it's really a beautiful way to reconciling apparently contradictory hadiths through the explanation of their meanings. And then there's difficult words, like for example, what does it mean when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said wa fakihatan wa abba. What is abba? They said to Sayyidina Umar, he said, I don't know what abba means, just read it. Allah said it, read it. So abba, so fruits, and then some produce, some thing that Allah created that is alongside with fruit, and He's using that to show the greatness of Allah's gift to mankind in their livelihood. And or if it's a word that is not frequently used, like qaswara in the Arabic language, and that was borrowed from Abyssinians to mean a lion. So so the Quran uses those terms. So all of this is gharib. Gharib al-Quran includes also the Arabized words of Quran, and Imam Suyuti has encyclopedia of those, as others do. Khafaji also has a beautiful book on gharib, which includes also hadith. Both of them from the scholars of Egypt. Then now ignorance, the reason for rejecting the aspersion of ignorance on narrators is that the narrator the ignorance of who the narrator is. That's the aspersion in the chain here. Now, I was completely wrong in attributing the ignorance to the narrator himself as his character. No, the ignorance of who that narrator is. We don't know who this man is. That there is a hadith that comes only through a chain, through that one man, and we don't know who he is. In Ibn Majah, where Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu says that a man is not asked for the reason why he beats his wife. And this is only narrated through a certain Abdurrahman ibn Fulan. He's majhul, he's unknown. Now this is enough reason to discard this hadith as weak, as something that is, and if someone is going to bring up that as a proof, then it's weak. It does not rise up to that in the Sharia. But if it concerned a good deed, then it is good enough. But here it does not concern the good deed. It concerns a legal ruling. So the jahala, the ignorance of who that person is. Now, that person also might be known as under various names. So he might be called something by which he is not known for some reason. For example, the books of Ibn Taymiyyah were forbidden in Syria for a while. So they were published under different names. Like instead of saying Ahmad ibn Taymiyyah, they would say Abu al-Abbas Taqi al-Din or Abu al-Abbas al-Harrani. Alright? So this because his full name includes those monikers or family attribution or tribal or place attribution and so forth, nisba. But he's not known as that. Like I mentioned before also, Abu Zahid, that would be the cognomen of Shaykh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda, but he's known by that, by Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda, not by Abu Zahid, right? So that's kind of making the narrator unknown. It makes him unknown, although he's well known, but he's not named in a way that makes him known. So anyway, there is a genre of al-mudih, the clarification, subgenre also of history and narrator biographies here that addresses this. So there you will know all of the ways by which a certain person were referred to in their lifetime or after that. And it might be that a certain narrator narrates very few things, and very few take from him also. So they compiled in that the genre of the wihdan, yani the unique reports, or they are not named for the sake of brevity, and so it will say عن فلان أو رجل عن رجل من أو عن بعض أفراد قبيلة كذا. So now here that's the genre of the anonymous mentions, mubhamat, and that is also in the Quran. وجاء رجل من أقصى المدينة يسعى. So who is that man? Or we know that it is Fulan, Ibn Fulan, or the man from Ahl al-Kitab who said to Sayyidina Sulaiman, I will bring it to you in the glimpse of an eye, right? And so on and so forth. What was the full name of Al-Khidr, and so on and so forth. So the mubhamat in the hadith also. A certain woman came and said, Ya Rasulullah, what does a woman do if she sees in her dream, and then as men do, and they discharge? And then Aisha radiallahu anha said, you dare say such a thing in front of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam? And or Salama said, women experience that, Ya Rasulullah, how can she mention such a thing? And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, no, let her ask. There is no bashfulness in asking about the religion. Who was that woman who came to ask? Now the science of anonymous mention. In this case it's very easy, because in the next few hadith down the same chapter in Sahih Muslim, she is named. She is named, but doesn't mean that maybe it's another incident. So maybe there's two women, you see. Now the art of anonymous mention is to reconcile all this and to tell you there were two incidents, or no, there were only one and that's the one. Or we could not find the name of that person. It can be a tribe, it can be a locality. And that's very important also for the circumstances in which Prophet ﷺ said certain hadiths, to pinpoint the time, the context. That's also part of anonymous mentions. And you cannot accept the anonymous narrator even if he is or she is mentioned anonymously, but with an addition that they are trustworthy. No, we need to verify that. You see, that's because some imams, some scholars say, the trustworthy one said to me. So who is that trustworthy one? Now when we know that is a habit that they have of always saying the trustworthy one for their Shaykh Fulan, okay, that's easy, right? But if we don't know that, unless it is someone like Imam Shafi, حدثني الثقة, so we can trust Imam Shafi. We cannot trust just everyone like that. So the default is that no, we need to verify ourselves, because we know that Shafi was strict. So, but others were not strict. It's not enough if they say that the thiqa, the trustworthy one, narrated to me. So if they are named and only one narrates from them, then it is an unknown in and of himself, majhul al-ayn. But if two and more narrate from them, from that single narrator, two or more narrate from that one, and no one in Islam has declared that one trustworthy or truthful or anything, what are we to do? We call that one majhul al-hal wa huwa al-mastur, yani the one whose situation or whose state is unknown, and we call him al-mastur. What is al-mastur?
He calls him a veiled reporter.
Veiled reporter. So now the innovation is either through something that tantamount to unbelief, or something that makes one merely quote unquote corrupt. Now, for example, tantamount to unbelief. Now, Imam al-Razi and Imam Ibn Hajar himself, in his commentary on these very lines, say that those who attribute a body to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are unbelievers by consensus. That is, exits them from Islam, because they are negating the fact that there is nothing like unto him, which is in the Holy Quran, attributing a body to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala like creatures. Now that would be a cause for, that's a bid'ah, an innovation of misguidance that tantamount to unbelief. Fisq would be for a narrator, for example, to be a drunkard, or to be routinely drinking alcohol, for example. So that's fisq. And or to be careless about salat or other things such as that. Or a fisq, also it could be a type of heretical innovation, not having to do with character, but they believe deeply in that, like i'tizal, mu'tazila, and so on and so forth. The whole of the non-Sunni sects, so the Ahl al-Hadith would consider that fisq also. And yet, as we said, some types of heresies did not discard automatically that one from being a reliable narrator. I mentioned the examples of Bukhari and Muslim narrating from various sectarians. So the first type, the bid'ah that is tantamount to kufr, one and all, or the massive majority of the scholars do not accept narrating from them. And the second type, they accept narrating from them as long as they do not call to their innovation actively, as long as they're not activists or proselytizing. That is the sounder position. That means there is another position that's against that. Except if he narrates whatever strengthens their innovation, then that is rejected according to the preferred position. And that is what Juzajani, the teacher of Nasa'i, said explicitly. Then, in the weak memory, now if that is always the state of that narrator, laziman, then we call that shadh, anomalous, according to one position. Or if it is in passing at times, then we call that mukhtalit, yani is mixed up.
Jumbled report.
Jumbled report, yeah. It's a jumbled report. And as long as the one of poor memorization is corroborated with a report fit for consideration, and similarly the mastur reporter, the one that is veiled, if we find a corroborant for their report, similarly the dispatched report, mursal, if we found again corroborant, similarly the concealer, mudallis, the ones that drop a link, that do not name a link or more in their chain, if we find corroborants for what they're reporting, their hadith, their text becomes fair, authentic, hasan, not in itself but collectively speaking. All right. Now the chain of transmission either explicitly ends up at the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or virtually, or by status. What we mean hukman, yani its status is that of a prophetic report. We mentioned that before. If Abu Huraira or Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As or Ibn Umar or Sayyidina Ali or any of the companions, or even any of the tabi'een also that are trustworthy, the tabi'een that are trustworthy, tell you that the punishment of the grave is such and such. How could they possibly know that except if they have received it through prophetic transmission, yani with a chain? But they are not naming their authorities up to the Prophet ﷺ, and they are saying it as if they are their own saying, but they could be saying it in a dars, in a teaching, in a class, in a sermon from the pulpit, in a fatwa, in an answer, saying, don't do that because such and such will happen at the time of death, or such and such. Meaning, they don't always say that the Holy Prophet ﷺ said, as our teacher narrated from their teacher, They don't, because the context doesn't lend itself always to a hadith session of narration, right? Sometimes it's just an answer that comes like that. But the status is, so that's what we mean by virtually prophetic. So as if he had said it, or done it, or approved it. Or if something goes back to a companion in the same way. And the companion is defined as, and this is important, how do we define the Sahabi? What is a Sahabi? It is one who laqiya, met the Prophet ﷺ as a believer in him and died a Muslim. Even if in between the two moments apostasy occurred. And this is a huge caveat or a huge qualification also, that he remains a companion. Because one might think that no, now he has become a tabi'i. You see, if there was apostasy, so then he became a believer again after that time of apostasy. And so therefore he is a Muslim of the next generation. Because what was before then has been cancelled. But no, Imam Ibn Hajar said no. Fil asah, yani the sounder position is that no, that one is still a companion. That sight and belief in the Prophet ﷺ at that time of belief, that when he saw him, is reinstated to describe him and define his identity. MashaAllah. This is interesting. Because there are people who saw the Prophet as an unbeliever, and then they accepted Islam after his time. That's the opposite thing. That's a tabi'i who saw the Prophet. How could that be? Subhanallah. A tabi'i who saw the Prophet? Kind of boggles the mind that this is not, brother, the definition of a tabi'i. But in that case it is, because we cannot call them a companion, because the companion, as he said, رأى النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم مؤمنا به. Okay, he must have seen the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم believing in him. Now in his sharh, he includes the babies of those who believed in him and who were brought in the presence of the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم, and whom the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم might have made tahniq of, because he routinely did that, especially for the people of Medina. They would routinely bring their babies for tahniq, yani the daubing of moist dates from the saliva of the Prophet ﷺ into their gums, right? Even before they had been weaned. So that time is necessary for the tahniq to be valid. Not after he grew up, you still bring him to the Shaykh, for please make tahniq. It's a bit late for this lad or lass. So, mashallah. But for barakah. So, they are considered Sahaba, mashallah. Abdullah ibn Talha ibn Zubair, for example. Allah Ta'ala alam. طيب, and so there are some Mu'tazila, of course, rejected, and some of our contemporaries who follow that path. Whether they know it or not, it is not Sunni. But they're gung-ho about it. So, no, they have to be knowledgeable of what they are seeing and believer. And some also insisted that no, they must accompany him a long time. It's not enough to see him as a believer in passing, like a Bedouin man like that, crossing paths with the Prophet, believing in him, saying Shahada, and say, I believe in you, and then dying a Muslim. This is not, they don't refuse to call him a Sahaba. What do they call him then? Cannot be called a Tabi'i. طيب. So the suhbah is a function of the Prophet's blessing on them, not of their ability, not of their qualification, and not of the time they spent with him. Wallahu ta'ala a'lam. Now, the tabi'i is the one that saw the Prophet, that saw the companion, just as the sahabi is the one that saw the Prophet in the same way, and believed. See, at the time of sight. So belief is important also for the definition of a tabi'i. So the first type of reports, the one that comes with a chain uninterrupted to the Prophet, is the marfu', the raised report. And that's why also we call the tariqah a tariqah Any tariqah, Sufi tariqah, we call it tariqah aliyah because it is going back to Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This is not from the wise saying of sages after the time of Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or of the imams, or of the companions, or of the Sufis. No. It goes back to him. It is from his teachings. It is a tariqah aliyah. It is not a man-made tariqah, as wise as they are. So the marfu' is raised up to the Prophet. This statement is not a man-made statement in the sense of unrevealed. No, this is revelation. So hadith marfu', raised up. And the second type is mawquf, stopping short, or stopping at the, what is
halted chain.
Halted chain. And then the third type is the maqtu', yani severed. So the severed chain is the chain that stops at the mouth of the tabi'i, and the halted chain is the chain that stops at the mouth of the companion, and the raised chain is the one that stops at the mouth of felicity, yani the mouth of bliss. Sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they say famus sa'ada, mouth of bliss, the description of the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then whoever is below the generation layer of the tabi'i is also called severed. And we call the last two types athar, report, or is that what we have?
Non-prophetic reports.
Yeah, reports, non-prophetic reports, because it could be said by a companion or a tabi'i. We also can call them khabar. All of these are generic. Even hadith is, generically speaking, a saying, right? So report, saying. But now, terminology, technically speaking, hadith is reserved for Prophet. Now the musnad report is the raised up report of a companion with a chain that is apparently well connected. That's when we call it a musnad report. So a musnad book is a collection of such reports. That's the criteria that a musnad book is supposed to meet, and the musnad of Imam Ahmad is exactly that way. And he arranged it according to Sahaba, the musnad of Abu Bakr Siddiq, and then the rest of the 10 promised paradise, the musnad of Ahlul Bayt, and then the musnad of individual Sahaba after that, and ending up with the musnad of people of this tribe, people of that tribe, because they only have, as individuals, one report. So they no need to have a chapter on that person, but you regroup the persons of that grouplet. You call it a musnad of that grouplet. So, and all of those musnad reports go back through that sahabi to the Prophet ﷺ with a chain that is apparently uninterrupted and has all the appearances of soundness or fairness. And if there is few, now what does the English have? فإن قل عدده.
For the outward appearance of being, if the numbers of the narrations in the chain are few, either it ends with the Prophet ﷺ.
Yeah, if the number of those narrations are few, either they end up to the Prophet ﷺ or to an authority with a lofty title such as Shu'ba, because Shu'ba is one of those also known as Amir al-Mu'minin fil Hadith. Now, this is a title that only about 30 narrators of Hadith have in all of the history of Hadith scholars. The author of this text being one of them. Amir al-Mu'minin in Hadith, commander of the believers in Hadith. So Shu'ba was one of them. That's what he means by an imam of a high title. So now the first one, now when we're talking about the narrators, if the chain has few narrators in them, it's a short chain now, and it's well connected, there is no gap in it. So we call that ulu mutlaq, absolute highness, the absolute highness of the chain, when there is really very few, that's great, because probabilistically there is no mistake at all in transmission. And there is less mistake than in any other scenario. We mentioned that before. And the second, when there is lofty names in the chain, even if there is more links, but those links are all distinguished people, then that is relative height of the chain. Ulu nisbi. You see, there is a relative distinction in that chain. So the absolute distinction is when the chain has a few links, therefore less mistakes. And the relative distinction is when the chain, the names of all of those people are great scholars. Yani, again, less risk of mistakes, but it is relative shortness. And we also mentioned at that time, when I mentioned that in tasawwuf, the more links you have, the more barakah. Therefore, height and distinction of chain in tasawwuf consists in a longer, not a shorter chain. You see? Because there will be additional strength and power and levels built up in that lofty chain. Now, and that's why in chains of hadith, the high chain will be usually between people who have like very young narrating from very old as much as possible. You see, so that each link of the chain will cover 75-year gap, a 50-year gap, sometimes even more than that. Like a grandfather before passing away, hearing that his son or daughter had a grandson or daughter, and then said, I include him also among those to whom I give ijaza. Bring me the papers and I will sign it so that they will have that honor when they grow up. You see? So that's like a 90-year gap, and that's great, because then they live on to live a long life also, and they do the same thing. So whereas in tasawwuf, they might be narrating from one another at practically the same level, they're very close contemporaries, right? The older one and the younger one, the older one and the younger one, like that. And then like Shaykh Khalid al-Baghdadi, his successor dying a few days after him, that one's successor being also a contemporary of Shaykh Khalid al-Baghdadi as well. See, so still that is considered a high chain because of their status, their level. Now there is muwafaqah, then the different types of chains connected to the fact of who you try to narrate from to make the chain shorter. Muwafaqa, agreement or congruence, is when you reach the teacher of one of the compilers, such as the teacher of Imam Nasa'i, the one from whom Bukhari narrated, the one from whom Tirmidhi narrates, the one from whom Tabarani narrates, with a different chain than the one that he used. And also substitution is when you reach the Shaykh of the Shaykh, similarly, a different chain. And then there is also musawat, yani pairing. And that's when the number of the links of a narrator, of you narrating whatever, from beginning to end is equal to the number of the links in the chain of one of the famous compilers. So you call that pairing. My chain is paired with his chain. Right? So all these are indicators of brilliance in your chain and of distinction in your chain, because you still achieve the same shortness and therefore distinction as one of those distinguished compilers, but through a different route of narrators. Now, those narrators also need to be strong, otherwise that brevity of chain becomes irrelevant if they're forgers or if they're weak. And then you also have the handshake chain, which is when there is parity with the student of that compiler, as if you were handshaking shaking hands with the compiler together with that student. So in contradistinction to all of these forms of height in the chain and distinction, there is also lowness in the chain. I mean, when the chain has much more links than it should have, I mean, there's no need for all those links, and yet you have that, so it becomes a long chain. It loses its distinction. So now, when the narrator narrates from someone the same age as them, and someone who also has met all of the shuyukh that the one narrating from him has met, then this is called aqran, contemporaries, exact contemporaries. Right? They are the same age, they have the same teachers, and if each one narrates from the other, we call that tadbij, mudabbaj, and that's sometimes a mark of humbleness. Please give me ijaza and allow me to narrate from you. And the other one will say, no, it is you who should give me ijaza, and I should be narrating from you. You should be my teacher. And the other one said, no, I want to narrate from you. So, and sometimes it can be even with a much older, like a sheikh. There was a sheikh Habib in the state of Johor, Habib Ali ibn Ja'far, and he loved Maulana Sheikh Nazim. He passed away a few years ago. He was very old, and I was visiting him with another Habib Ali Jafri. And Habib Ali Jafri, of course, is very keen on collecting as many ijazas, and he's very adamant in that. So he asked him for ijaza, and this old sheikh said, no, you should be giving me ijaza. Habib Ali, of course, said, no, of course not. And then he would not give ijaza until first Habib Ali gave him ijaza, out of humbleness of that older one. So you see, the older the one who's being asked is, when he himself asks for the younger one to give, the more humble he is, and he beats the younger one's humbleness. You cannot beat the older one's humbleness that way. But usually that happens when they are exact contemporaries. So if someone asks you and they are the same age, and you say, all right, you have completely failed, because it's like you assume that, of course, I would be the one who's asked, and I should not be doing the asking. So that means that you have a arrogant soul. Billah. So that's tadbij, and tadbij is also well considered in the pedigrees of hadith scholars, and it has a section of its own. Don't always look for high chains. Tadbij also tells you about character and about your contemporaries. It adds information as well. And if one narrates from one below them in age, then it is called seniors from juniors, akabir from asabir. And of that type also there is the fathers from sons, and of course the opposite is abundant, right? Like Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad, like Ibn Burayda from Burayda, and like that. The son usually narrates from the father, like Ibn Umar from Umar, and so forth. But sometimes you have the father narrating from the son. And there is also the types of hadith that one who narrates from their father, from their grandfather, right? So, like Abdullah ibn Amr ibn Shu'aib from his father, from his grandfather, Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As. So, and if two narrate together from a sheikh, and one of them dies before the other, we call that as-sabiq wal-lahiq, because sometimes two people narrate from the same sheikh. One of them dies, and the other survives 40 years. Right? So when you look at the biography of the second one, you would say, no, it's impossible that the first one also narrated from the same sheikh. Look, the second one died 40 years later. Surely there must be a missing link between the first one's narration from the same sheikh, because he died 40 years earlier. No. This is sabiq wal lahiq. They were contemporaries, and one died a long time before the second one. The second one lived a longer life, that's all. So you see, this is a special biographical science where the investigator detects that and preempts your misassumption. It is normal assumption, but it is false in that case. طيب وإن روى عن اثنين متفقي الاسم ولم يتميزا. When they narrate from two narrators and both of them have the same name, and we don't know which one we mean. Do you mean the one that is from Nisabur or the one that is from Basra? Because they have the same name, the same father's name. So you might how does he say in English?
He says, if he relates from two sheikhs whose name match and cannot be differentiated, then the fact that he specializes in narrations from one of them is a sign that the other one is irrelevant.
Yes, he specialized. Now that the one that he narrates from, we know that he has a student from that place, and that student always narrates from that one. So we don't need to bring in the other possibility with the same name, because we clearly know that that's not the one who is meant. Right. Like for example, if At-Tirmidhi says, I asked Muhammad about that, who does he mean? He means Bukhari, Muhammad ibn Ismail al-Bukhari. So he's not going to say Muhammad ibn Ismail al-Bukhari always. We know that he is his close student, to the point that Bukhari said to him, I benefited from you more than you benefited from me, from the humbleness of Imam Bukhari to Imam At-Tirmidhi. How much they loved and respected one another. Allah gave them that qabul of the ummah, so that everything we read from their books, all the ajr of reading, studying, practicing goes to them also. And if the one narrator denies categorically that they ever narrated such a thing, it is rejected. Because maybe it happened 20 years ago, you meet them again and you say, no, I never narrated that to you. No, I have it in my record that you did, and there's others also who have the same record. It is rejected. They're forgetting it. They forgot it. So we don't take their own words about their own narration seriously. Rudda. Because maybe either they changed their attitude towards it, or they became senile, or they just forgot, honestly. So that's an honest mistake on their part. So we cannot change the written record, especially if it's corroborated by other students of that time. Right? Or possibly, either categorically or possibly. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Now, if possibly, then it is accepted that the doubt, there is a doubt, a creeping doubt, makes sense. Now that subgenre is called those who narrated then forgot. And if the narrators use the same formula of conveyance or other than that type of pattern, it is called musalsal. We have mentioned that a lot in the past lessons. Pattern chained hadith. You say, I narrated this on a Thursday from my Shaykh. He said, I narrated this on a Thursday from my Shaykh. I narrated this from... There is a pattern that repeats itself in the chain. It's called the pattern chained hadith. Now, the forms of conveyance, right? Is that how we translate? Is sami'tu, I heard, and he narrated to me. These are the two strongest, because they show that there was a face-to-face encounter with full audition, right? And that the speaker was the one you convey from, right? The teacher is saying this. Then akhbarani, he related to me, and I read before him. When we say him, he, etc., it means she, her as well, because many of those hadith scholars, by the hundreds and thousands, were also women. And then if we say the fifth form now, it was read before him as I was listening. Big gathering. And then after that, he informed me. And then he handed over to me. And then he said to me, what?
He says he told me verbally.
He told me verbally, yes. He told me verbally. There is a hierarchical sequence here from in descending order of strength. So we pay close attention to those terms because they are technical terms and they differ one from another. And then he wrote to me, and then from, like we said, from, and the like he said. All right, this was mentioned before. Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar. So the first two are used for someone who was sitting alone with the Shaykh and heard this in the wording of the Shaykh himself. Now, if they are in group, we use that in the plural, حدثنا instead of حدثني, or سمعنا instead of سمعت. And the first one is the most explicit and the highest and most distinguished in hadith dictation, meaning سمعت حدثني. طيب. Now or سمعت rather, سمعته قال. Right. Now the third and the fourth is for those who who read individually before the Shaykh. أخبرني وقرأت عليه. Right, one on one, but you are doing the reading and the Shaykh is listening and approving. And then you can use it in the plural, in which case it becomes like the fifth, right? Which is it was read before him and I was listening. Now, but informing is in the same sense as reporting, except that in the custom of later scholars, it is for ijaza, permission to transmit from that one. Just as an is also used for ijaza. You narrate an from that person. You are narrating from them, but it is not because they read to you or you heard them say, or it was read before them and you were present. No, none of this took place. It is a pure permission without any text being read in their presence. So now the an'ana of the contemporary, that when the contemporary uses an, it is understood as audition, except if he is a concealer. And it is said that you have to have a proof of their meeting even one time. It's not enough that they just be contemporary, historically speaking. All right. And that is the chosen and preferred position. And then they mentioned the verbatim speech in ijaza, where the teacher says that the teacher says that he or she is giving ijaza to the student. So they say shafahani in that sense. Not that they read hadith, they read out the giving of permission. And writing of the ijaza is through correspondence. You can send it even if they never met. So it's below the verbatim permission. But then writing, they have a written ijaza, which is also well regarded. And they made it a precondition for the soundness of handing over its being together with permission to narrate. Like for example, Imam Kawthari, you may have heard of him, handed over his catalog of narrations, or catalog of teachers from whom he narrates, handed it over to one of my teachers, Shaykh Wahbi Sulaiman Ghawji al-Albani. And that teacher was 15 years old in Azhar Sharif, and he took it. But then I said to him, oh, my Shaykh, then you narrate from Imam al-Kawthari. This is amazing. And he said, no, I don't like to say that, because he didn't say at the time, I give you permission to narrate everything that's in this catalog from me. And since he didn't say it, I feel reluctant to narrate from him in that sense. So I narrate it from him through an intermediary, through those who have well-established ijazah from him. But this doesn't constitute for me ijazah, the fact that he gave me istabat. So some people considered it ijazah, because why else would he give him istabat, except for him to perpetuate the transmission from him, from the senior. Allah knows best. I like to think that it meant ijazah. This way I can narrate from Kawthari with only one link in between. Wallahu ta'ala alam. And we will finish this paragraph inshallah, and then we'll pray Maghrib. So if there is permission, then that is the highest of the types of permission to narrate. Because then we narrate with full knowledge of that shaykh's chains of transmission. Otherwise you have to research them, and you better be good at that, otherwise you'll be making mistake after mistake. And even if you claim to have, dug up the chains of transmission, you have to have knowledge of all of the isnad literature in order to do that. Otherwise, they digested it for you when they give you their thabat. And then they also said it is conditional to have permission in wijada. Yani when you say, I found your book. And then that doesn't mean that he gave permission to narrate it. But he says, all right, you may narrate it from me. All right, I will. Right? So as if they spontaneously gave the book with permission to narrate. And then similarly the wasiyya bil kitab, like testaments, that I want so and so to have my book narrated from me after my death. And then in informing that, by the way, this is my book, or I have authored such books, so this is also a form of conveyed from me, so a form of permission. But in all of these, they want explicit permission in order to this to really stick, right, as a permitted conveyance. Otherwise, it is not considered valid. Just as also invalid, they considered the universal ijazah. As for example, when a scholar says, I want all of my contemporaries that live in my time as Muslims, I give them all, the one says like Imam Nabhani, permission to narrate from me. He gave that to all of his contemporaries. Yes. And so the precondition is that one be born a Muslim before the time of that universal ijazah giver's death, right? So you have to you have to know the time of death, and you check that against your time of birth as a Muslim. If you are a convert, then from the time of conversion, unless you say that you are born a Muslim, like يولد الإنسان على الفطرة, meaning according to Islam. ثم أبواه يهودانه أو يمجسانه أو ينصرانه. And so up to the time of the age of reason, that time might consider that. Would that be considered? I asked Shaykh Muhammad Yaqubi about it. He said no. And then when I look at what Imam Ibn Hajar said about the ridda in between, dying upon a Muslim and meeting the Prophet as a Muslim, I am encouraged to think yes, because of that analogy. Allah Ta'ala knows best. We need to investigate that further. But these are the weakest type, right? Ijaza amma li ahli al-asr, because there is anonymity in all that. But it is husn al-zan in the ummah of the Holy Prophet ﷺ. And so ultimately the anonymity is lifted up by the fact that this is for the honor of the Prophet ﷺ himself, that trickles down to the whole of the ummah, and inshallah it will benefit them. And this is great to know. Among the contemporaries, Imam Habib Ahmad Mashhur bin Taha al-Haddad gave ijazah to all of the people of his time, and he died in 1995. So therefore, if you wish to narrate from him through that, you may, and that is a high chain of transmission, because it is distinct, it is high, it is short chain as well as distinguished, mashallah. And there is many others, and you have to ask me, and I may reveal them to you. So, or keep them to myself. This is how scholars are, unfortunately. They have this sort of turfy character based on their research and the sweat of their brow that they want to keep to themselves. And they also want the sheikhs that they narrate from to die quickly so that no one else will narrate from them. Astaghfirullah. That's why Zainuddin al-Iraqi said, you know, the one to whom I give ijazah, he wishes my death, but I wish for them to live long. You know, because then the one who dies quickly and then the other one who narrates from them lives long, that makes the chain very distinguished, the longer they live, until they are become the last one to narrate from that senior one who died a long time ago. You see? So literally he says, he wishes my death and I wish for them to live long. Alas, that's our state for high chains. No. So, and also ijaza for the unknown. Ijaza for the unknown. Yani I give ijaza to Khalid. Who's Khalid? Which Khalid do you mean? Khalid. So if that person does that and then they walk out, they travel or they pass away or they disappear, we don't know which Khalid. We cannot. So, what kind of ijaza is that? It is not considered. And ijaza for the one who does not exist yet. For example, ijaza to the sons and the grandsons and the descendants. So sons and daughters, grandsons and daughters, and descendants to the day of resurrection. They said no, you cannot do that. Although, yeah, some scholars do that. Some Habibs also do that. And Imam Hajar says humbly here, that's the sounder position in all of this. He's saying, as if saying, Allah knows best. That's what we consider the most authentic position. And we stop here for Salatul Maghrib, inshallah. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. بالإسناد المتصل إلى الإمام ابن حجر العسقلاني أمير المؤمنين في الحديث قال: ثم رواته. Furthermore, narrators, if their names are the same, as well as the names of their fathers, and so on and so forth, meaning grandfather, and maybe also cognomen. Yani they are let's say two narrators that have the same kunya, Abu al-Abbas, and the same first name and the same name of the father and the same grandfather. But they are two different people. Like for example, Sa'd ibn Malik, that's the name of many of the Sahabas. Many of the Sahabas are known as Sa'd ibn Malik. They are not the same people. So this is called the science or the discipline of al-muttafiq wal-muftariq. Al-muttafiq bil-ism wal-muftariq bil-hawiyya. Yani they have the same name but they have different identities. And if the names are one and the same in writing but different in pronunciation, like for example, Asid, Usaid, Zabir, Zubair, Abid, Ubaid, can happen. That we call that mu'talif wa mukhtalif. Again, يعني the muttafiq and muftariq, mu'talif and mukhtalif. How does he translate?
Same name, different identity narrator.
That's the first one.
And homographic, heterophonic.
Okay. Homographic, written the same. Heterophonic, pronounced differently. Right. And if the names are the same and the fathers differ, or vice versa, that is called the mutashabih. Yani the
same name, different father or son narrators.
Okay, right. Yeah, because mutashabih really is too vague, you know. The English is more precise, but mutashabih in hadith, that's what it means. You see, mutashabih in Quran is mutashabih lughawi, right? Like same passages can be a single word or it can be whole passages. Wallahu ala kulli shayin qadir has many instances, and or it can be mutashabih of, like in Surah Al-Imran, yani the ambiguities and obscurities and the ones that activate the heresies of people who have something wrong in their doctrine. And here in hadith it is just similarities in names but not in the names of father. And similarly, if the sameness is in the name and the name of the father, but the difference is in the family affiliation or tribal affiliation or place affiliation. Now you have combinations of the above and of the preceding categories also, different types. Sometimes there is ittifaq and ishtibah, yani same names, different fathers, that's ishtibah, and ittifaq is sameness except in one letter or two letters, or in position, or before and after, or the like. So these are subtle and specialized cases, and to understand we'd have to look up the examples he gives in his own commentary on this text. Conclusion. It is important, the conclusion is quite long, so let's be patient, but inshallah just one page left after this short paragraph. And it is important to know the biographical layers of narrators, their times of birth, their times of death, their places of origin or of activity, their states with regard to probity, yani are they upright or not, with regard to disparagement, are they disparaged as narrators or not, for reasons of either character or of simple meticulousness that is not there, or memorization that is lacking, or not knowing who they are, jahala, so anonymity. And then the layers of disparagement are, and in descending order of gravity. Now these are the how we say, the monikers that they use, or the labels that they use to describe a person as disparaged and unreliable in hadith. So in descending order of gravity, the most important is akdhab al-nas, the most lying of people. And after that, Dajjal, which means arch liar. So of course the Dajjal will be the most lying of people, and then after that there's mini Dajjals, generic common Dajjals, and then there's the Dajjal, that would be the akdhab al-nas, the most lying of people. But these are used hyperbolically, because if literally, then one is claiming ilm of the unseen, ilm al-ghaib. Say, how do you know that such a person is the most lying of people? But so it's hyperbole. And I've never seen someone like that before. And then arch fabricator, waddah, not only wadi', but waddah, dajjal. These are intensive forms, grammatically or etymologically. Or kadhab, or arch liar. Again, kadhab, arch liar. And then in the lighter ones are layyin, soft, or sayyi'ul hifdhi, of bad memory, or fihi maqal. They have some discussion around that one. Fihi maqal. Does he have?
I think he actually doesn't translate it. He says the slightest is malleable. Oh, there he goes. Yeah, the slightest is malleable, chronically forgetful, and he leaves something to be desired.
Yeah. فيه مقال. He leaves something to be said, something to be desired. And then the levels of accreditation.
The ranks of commendation.
The ranks of commendation, yeah, better. Ranks of commendation. You know, Sheikh Musa Ferber did this text. And alhamdulillah, we sat long hours in the house of Maulana Sheikh Nazim in Damascus, reviewing it, reviewing the wording. We worked very hard on that, but it's not, yani these terms don't come easily, you know, disparagement, commendation, and so forth, but that's, inshallah, they are exact equivalents of the Arabic. And we try not to use the same thing for two different words in the Arabic. In English, the term must be different if the term is different in Arabic as well. So which one we choose is important. So in descending order of praise, first it's the most trustworthy of people, and then what you repeat twice of the attributes of recommendation, such as ثقة, يعني trustworthy. This is obviously stronger than just ثقة, which is strong enough in itself. ثقة. Then after that, ثقة حافظ, يعني trustworthy and a master of memorization. And then, so there is more than that. For example, جبل في الثقة, a mountain of trustworthiness, or يعني إمام الدنيا, like for example Bukhari, Tabarani, Ibn Asakir. These were described like that. طيب. And then the lowest ones suggest nearness to the highest ones of discreditation. For example, a sheikh, he's a sheikh. So we mean by that he's a pious, noble person, but they did not make narrating of hadith their specialty. They're a sheikh. Or maybe they're someone who never narrated hadith in the first place, but because they are relatives, right, of people who lived near the descendants of the Prophet ﷺ in the early centuries. Imam al-Waqidi in his seerah, he would research people like that, and he would just try to catch any thread of information. And he could about the life of Medina in those times, you know, through those recorded home records of, you know, like oral history today of times bygone, but not so far past, you know, like 200 years later. Like Malay oral history or slave oral history, like that. So this counts. So the person who narrates does not have to be so knowledgeable or so trained or to have narration as their daily activity. So sheikh. وتقبل التزكية من عارف بأسبابها. يعني now who decides that a person is trustworthy? So such commendation is accepted by from an expert of what makes it, you know, what constitutes it, or its causes, its reasons, even if there is only one making such a verdict. That's the most correct position. And we found no one else who called such a person thiqa. But if there is one expert who did that, that's enough. And we accept that as a thiqa. It does not have to be several people or certainly not consensus. But if there's consensus, that means really that is a well-known thiqa. And then, as a rule, discreditation takes precedence over commendation. Disparagement that's a precautionary measure, you see. Because it's better to discredit someone who could have been retained than to accept someone who in reality should have been disregarded, you see. So therefore they tend to be severe here. If such discreditation is pronounced by with an explanation of why, by an expert in the reasons why someone is discredited. See that there's preconditions. It's not enough to say no, don't narrate from him. Also, if it's only one who is very severe, like Nasa'i, he's more severe than Bukhari. But when he's the only one who discredits someone and others do not, then Nasa'i's discreditation is not accepted, it's not retained, you see. So they also listed who is extremely severe. In case they alone discredit someone, then that verdict is not retained. Who alone also is very lenient. And if they are the only ones who are actually commanding and pray, then that also is not retained. You see, they always try to reach a middle way in reaching a final verdict. Now, if a person has no ranking of either discreditation or commendation, خلع عن التعديل. قُبِلَ مُجْمَلًا على المختار. يعني it is generally speaking without specification, then that person, the default is that they are trustworthy, because the ummah of the Prophet, you see, especially if they belong to one of the first 3 centuries, because Prophet actually praised those first 3 centuries, you see. So we assume that they are a trustworthy person of prophetic sunnah, and we're going to accept. That's the preferred position, because there's other positions that are more severe than that. But he says that's the position I prefer. And section, it is important to know the cognomen of those whose names we know. And for example, Abu what, what, Ibn what, to know the cognomens, what they are famed for, as cognomen. And what is the cognomen or the patronymic of Mawlana Shaykh Nazim? Abu? Yes, Abu Muhammad, because his first born son is Muhammad. Okay, so that's the cognomen. And it is important also to know the names of those whose cognomen we know very well. Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, we know his cognomen. We know him by his cognomen. Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, and others. So what is the name of Sayyidina Abu Bakr as-Siddiq? Yeah, Abdullah ibn Abi Quhafa. Okay, what is now the name of Abu Quhafa? Uthman. Abdullah ibn Uthman. So it's good to know, like, the reverse also, and whose name consists in their kunya as well. Sometimes there's just that. There is only especially among latter day scholars. It's how many of the Habaibs are called Abu Bakr, and that's it. There is no other. Abu Bakr, their kunya is their name. That's their name, right? Okay. And those who have different kunyas, some call them by this kunya, others by that kunya. So Abu al-Mahasin or Abu al-Is'ad, for example, for a latter day scholar of hadith. And then those who have many kunyas and many nu'ut, descriptives for them. And those whose kunya is actually the name of their father. So, or the reverse. Or their kunya is the kunya of is also the kunya of their wife. Like Abu Darda, Darda. That's not a given. Like Abu Bakr, Ruman, his wife. So, Abu Darda, Darda. She was a great jurist, and I believe a tabi'iyah. Yeah. She used to keep the forms of prayer just like men, the postures of prayer. That was her fiqh. That's what she understood of. And she has certain answers in fiqh also that are known, and she used to be consulted by the Amir al-Mu'mineen of her time. And then Abu Dhar and Dhar also, same thing. Abu Dhar, Sahabi, al-Ghifari. And then those who are known as Ibn other than their father. Like, for example, Ibn Ulayya, great mufassir of the Tabi'een, Ibn Ulayya. He has a very spiritual tafsir also, and very beautiful. I quote him in the book Muhammad and Light. Ibn Ulayya, that's his mother's name. He's not known by his father's name. He disliked to be called Ibn Ulayya, but that's how he's known, actually. Abu Huraira disliked to be called Abu Huraira. Yeah, because he said the Prophet ﷺ did not nickname me that. He said, the Prophet nicknamed me Abu Hir. Abu Hir, masculine and without diminutive. So they diminished it and they feminized it. It's Abu Hurra would be the feminine form, and diminutive Huraira also. Why? Because it's easier. Abu Hir is hard. It's you can miss it also if someone Abu Hir. What? Abu Huraira, you cannot miss it. Allahu A'lam. Then, or to other than what the mind understands quickly. Yani, other than what the mind first supposes. Their kunya it's not a person. It might be Abu something. Abu al-Is'ad, for example. This is not a person. It is Abu al-Fadl. Abu al-Fadl, you can think that it's a person, like Abu al-Fadl ibn Abbas, the brother of Abdullah ibn Abbas. Al-Fadl, that's a name. But it can be in modern times also Abu al-Fadl, meaning like Abu al-Fadl, Abu al-Khair, Abu al-Is'ad, equality. But their sons are not named like that. Okay. وَمَنْ اتَّفَقَ اسْمُهُ وَاسْمُ أَبِيهِ وَجَدِّهِ. Those who have the same name as, like Sayyidina Imam Ghazali, Muhammad ibn Muhammad ibn Muhammad. Or the name of their sheikh and the sheikh of their sheikh, and so on and so forth. And those who have the same name as their sheikh and the one who narrates from them. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad. Like Ibn Hajar, narrating from Al-Ramli, narrating from Ibn Hajar. Which Ibn Hajar we mean here? Ibn Hajar al-Haytami, narrating from Khairuddin al-Ramli, narrating from Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani. So, we have to know. And by the way, we do not spell Ibn Hajar al-Haytami with a tha. That's a frequent mistake of booksellers and book printers and also some scholars. Haythami, no, it's Haytami. Haytami. Al-Haythami is Nuruddin al-Haythami, the student of Zainuddin al-Iraqi and colleague, senior colleague of Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani. That's Nuruddin al-Haythami, the author of Majma' al-Zawaid wa Manba' al-Fawaid. But as for al-Haytami, the great Shafi'i, they are all Shafi'i also. The faqih, the jurist, that's Ibn Hajar al-Haytami, Ahmad ibn Hajar al-Haytami. That's another confusion. This Ibn Hajar al-Haytami is Ahmad ibn Hajar, just like al-Asqalani, Ahmad ibn Hajar also. So we need to know the names in between Ahmad ibn Ali, so forth, as we said. Ahmad ibn Ali ibn Muhammad ibn Hajar. But sometimes we jump to the ancestor because that's the famous one. Ibn Hajar, that's much more rare than Ahmad and Ali and Muhammad. So we jump to that. طيب. Ibn Hanbal, it's not Ahmad ibn Hanbal, it's Ahmad ibn Muhammad ibn Hanbal. But it's shorter form, and so we ascribe him to the grandfather directly, Ahmad ibn Hanbal. طيب. So we need to know that the one you are naming there is not his father but his grandfather. And then the art of the knowing the name who are single names and you know who he is. Shu'ba. And who is Jabir? When we say Abdullah, who is that in hadith? It's Ibn Mas'ud. Although there are many Abdullah, or as they say in Arabic, Abadila, many among the Sahaba who narrate. But when we say just the name Abdullah in a chain, we mean Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. When we say just Sufyan, although there are several, at least two famous ones, Ibn Uyayna and al-Thawri, we mean al-Thawri. When we say Jabir, we mean Jabir ibn Abdullah al-Ansari. And also the unique names, like Kailaj, or others, rare unique names. And then the kuna and alqab, the nicknames, and ansab, yani the affiliation names like al-Ansari, al-Khazraji, al-Awsi, Sometimes they are identified by those. And then also the tribal names for Arabs and the place location names for non-Arabs, because non-Arabs or urbanized Arabs also, they have no idea what their tribe is. They don't have that knowledge anymore. It's finished, it's lost. So they are not known according to tribes, they are known according to location. Basri, Beiruti, Lubnani, blah blah blah, like that. And as for the pure Arabs, they are known, they are affiliated to their tribe. And they should retain that. If that knowledge has reached down the centuries to them, especially the Ahlul Bayt, they retain that, of course. I mean, Hashimi and Hassani, Husseini. This is because going back to the Banu Hashim of Quraysh or Qurashi, like that. So this is a knowledge that should not be lost. And then, according to countries or villages or even sukakan, street, alleys, or mujawaratan, the places where you spend time, like if you were jiwar, mujawir in Mecca, so Jarullah, or in Medina, Jar Rasulillah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or Jar kada of localities. And also sana'i and hiraf, yani professions and crafts, arts and crafts, like for example Haddad, Khabbaz, Najjar, all of these, and Qabban also, Sajjad, and all of that, Al-Katib, there are so many. And so, like meaning, respectively, Haddad, blacksmith, Khabbaz, baker, Najjar, mason, and so on and so forth, rope maker, whatever. All of these, they become names. And Bazzaz, silk, and Bazzar, grain seller, grain merchant. And then in those names also there is ittifaq and ishtibah. And sometimes people who have the same ones, but they're 2 different persons, 3 different, 4 different persons. There are different bazzars and bazzars. And then it can, they can be used as nicknames and not as all of the aboves. Alqab only. All right. For example, sometimes also when we say Badri, al-Badri, what do we mean? He fought at Badr. Okay, he's a Badri. But Abu Mas'ud al-Badri, alone among the companions, is known as a Badri who did not fight at Badr. What does it mean that we call him al-Badri, Abu Mas'ud al-Badri? Because he chose Badr as a location after the Battle of Badr. He moved there to live there. So he's known as Abu Mas'ud al-Badri, not that he took part in the... So because, and someone might look for him in the list of the Ashab Badr and not find him and say, no, why you call him Abu? Because he moved there. And so the reason you see is other than what comes to mind. This is an example of something that passed before. And then knowledge of the Mawali from top down. So who is patron and who is freed man or freed woman, like Barira or Buraira, the freed woman of the Holy Prophet ﷺ. Thawban, the freed man of the Prophet ﷺ. So when we say Mawla ibn Abbas, Mawla Zayd, Mawla ibn Umar, we must know what's the relationship between them from top to bottom, meaning the patron and the freed person. Is it through riq, yani emancipation? Riq is slavery, but so when they become a freed person, then they are called Mawla. Or is it through alliance? Like for example, when we say Abu Hanifa and Nu'man ibn Thabit, Abu Hanifa at-Taymi mawlahum. And he is Taymi through alliance. He is the Mawla of the Banu Taym. He was not born a Banu Taym, but rather he is a Persian who's his forefathers. And then they made an alliance. So they became Mawla of that tribe, so they may be called Taymi after that tribe. And now in modern times actually, and in long after that system no longer exists, but there is an alliance for the one who converts to whoever he converts at the hand of them. You see? So if, for example, the group or the person at whose hand they made Shahada of Islam is Turkish, that person is Mawla of the Turks, actually. But people don't observe that anymore. In other words, that person, the Turkish person, their neighborhood, their family at least, or their clan, their tribe, their community, have to support the other person financially, socially, because that person has lost their previous identities, finished. Their reputation, their finances, sometimes their land, their house might all be gone, finished now, because they're disowned by their own parents, brothers, sisters, society, community. They are no longer people who come from that locality anymore, or who have connections there, or holdings, or whatever, finished, it's all gone. So they're like now born again in the world with completely lost. So they are embraced by that. That is wala. That's exactly the what is meant by hilf, alliance here. And that's what was benefiting at the time also, that they entered Islam. So now they become known as Taymi, Mawlahum. You add that Mawlahum through alliance, through wala, yani patronage. And then knowledge of the brothers and sisters, and knowledge of the ethics of the teacher and the student. There is a beautiful book by al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, al-Jami' fi adab al-Rawi was-Sami', and that has like an encyclopedia of all of those ethics, and it's a very beautiful book showing how to study, how to teach, what is expected of each, and so forth. And then the age of the correct minimum age of carrying on, taking on hadith narration, and the correct minimum age of conveying it. So according to the muhaddithin, taking on the correct minimum age is 4 or 5 years old, because that sahabi said, I remember when I was 4, the Prophet ﷺ took a gulp of water and then sprayed it in my face. And so he was 5 years old, and he's narrating this, and this is a hadith. This is a hadith of an act of the Prophet ﷺ with the Sahabi, and he says, I was 4 or 5 years old, so they took that as their standard of minimum age. And then Imam Zahabi said, as for the age when they begin, 50 years old, something like that. 50 years old, yani even if they reach 40, the age of average age of prophethood, risala, it's for common people, it's not enough. 50 is when the shuyukh of that person have started dying off and gone. And now he's carrying a knowledge that's becoming rarer and rarer. He has to convey it. That time there is permission for him or her to start narrating with chances, with greater chances of sincerity and benefit. So, then the attributes of the writer of hadith and the one that the one that presents hadith, reads out hadith, because writing hadith you have to choose the one with the best handwriting and with a sense of calligraphy and also of spelling, grammar. Then ard, the one who is reading in front of the sheikh for the benefit of all. Yani the one who was reading for Shaykh Abdurrahman Shaghuri was Fulan, and then it was Fulan. They're known in Damascus, right? So they have to have also good grammar, good voice, and adab in reading, and sense of when to stop, when to start, and to listen to the Shaykh's signals, might be voice and other than voice. And then hearing hadith, the other ethics of the student of hadith, hearing it and then making it heard, isma'i. Like for example, how did they make 10,000, 20,000 people hear the hadith? Because they had musammiya, every 10 rows, let's say, or every distance or so, there would be people standing and repeating, just as we do in salat without microphones. For the imam to be heard by those at the very end, you need musammi'a in between every short distance or so. Same with hadith, and that's how they could cover a huge amount. Like they have great numbers, like 10 and up to 20,000 reading, hearing hadith from Bukhari. They all wanted to take from him before he left this world, you see. So the classes were more and more massive until the fitna worked against him. And yes, he also was subject to several fitnas, some political, and the last one in his life was by other scholars who were jealous of him and who found points of aqidah where they wanted to sink him in the eyes of the public until they expelled him. And he died alone in Tashkent, and he was saying, I don't blame anyone and I forgive everyone. I don't want anyone to be taken to task for what they did to me. Right? Although he was deeply hurt, and that shows even in the lines of his Sahih. If you know, if you see the way that he refers to some people by other than their famous names, as if he's mentioning them, but he's also burying them at the same time. Yeah, because they hurt him, they harmed him. طيب. So رحم الله الجميع ونفعنا بهم آمين. So then the ethics of traveling for hadith. And again, Bukhari traveled a lot for hadith. And again, Khatib al-Baghdadi has a book on all of these sub-sciences. Khatib al-Baghdadi is a really mine of knowledge, encyclopedist of all of these attributes of hadith, its chains and its narrators. And he has a book called Al-Rihlatu fi Talab al-Hadith. I'll give you an example of this rihla. Abdullah ibn Unais traveling from Kufa to Damascus to hear Jabir ibn Abdullah going to meet Abdullah ibn Unais in Damascus. And Jabir left Kufa, traveled, and then he arrived and he said to the servant person, tell the master that Jabir is here, coming from Kufa, and I want to meet him to hear a hadith from him. And so they went upstairs and they said, Jabir is here. Jabir from Kufa. Jabir ibn Abdullah. And then Abdullah ibn Unais went down and he's dragging his izar behind him, not even having time to tie it properly and to be presentable. And then they met at the door of the house, hugged, wept, and stayed silent. And then they went in, and then Jabir said, I just want to hear a hadith from you. I want to go. I just want to hear this one hadith from you. Because I heard that you heard it from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and I want to take it from you. I did not hear it from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but I know that this was common knowledge. So he said yes, and he knew what hadith he meant, and he told him, يحشر الناس, people shall be resurrected, غرلا بهما, they will be resurrected naked, destitute, uncircumcised, and they will be gathered and he made like the Prophet ﷺ had made, pointing towards Sham, and they would be gathered in that direction, and that was the hadith. And then he said, now let me go. And that is an example, the first hadith that Imam Khatib al-Baghdadi, غُرْلًا بُهْمًا حُجْلًا, I think it was, naked, destitute, and uncircumcised. So, and then he went back. That's the first hadith that he narrates in his book Al-Rihla, traveling in search or in the pursuit of hadith. And then how the hadith is compiled according to Musnad, like we defined it before, or according to chapters, like Abu Dawood and Tirmidhi, chapters that are related to fiqh, like in the Sunan, ways of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And other types, like the chapter titles of Bukhari are, his whole mazhab are in those chapter titles. He said Fiqh al-Bukhari fi abwabihi. And then or according to ilal, like the Musnad of Imam al-Bazzar is supposed to be actually a book of ilal, a book of gharib, of hadith, hadith al-gharib, or defects in hadith. The Sunan of Daraqutni, same thing. It's not meant to be a Sunan in the same way as the 4 books of Sunan that we know. Or atraf, or alphabetically. Okay. Like for example, Jami' al-Saghir by Imam Suyuti, Ramuz al-Ahadith that every Turk must know, by our Naqshbandi Grand Sheikh Kumushkhanawi, Diyauddin. We mentioned him before. And then the knowledge of the reason for which a hadith was spoken or done, acted. So that's Ma'rifat Sabab al-Hadith. And Al-Hamzawi has the reference book in that. Al-Hamzawi, and I think he's a Husayni also. Our teacher, Dr. Samir al-Nas, is preparing a big book on that, actually. A re-edition and a commentary on Hamzawi and an expansion on Hamzawi's book. Knowing the context in which the hadith took place is very important to reconstitute the puzzle. Like a movie, like you were there. You have to think of that science to aim to bring you there as if you were there watching before, during and after, not just during in a vacuum. And then some of the shuyukh of Qadi Abu Ya'la ibn al-Farra al-Hanbali also authored in that, and they also authored compilations in all of these above types. I mentioned some examples by Khatib Baghdadi, and they are strictly a matter of narrating what you heard before. It's not an issue of thinking about it and making ijtihad about it. It's naql mahd. And you have to have a strong athari, a transmissive bent to gather up all this information about hadith and everything related to it with the subsequent biographical layers. A historian, basically, of texts. And then they are in no need of definition. They are self-defined, self-evident, and they are in no need of examples also. So you may, and also وَحَصْرُهَا مُتَعَسِّرٌ, it is difficult to encompass them. So let them be reviewed in the long books that are concerned. فَلْتُرَاجَعْ لَهَا مَبْسُوطَاتُهَا. The long compendiums regarding those topics can be consulted. And it is Allah who grants success and who guides. There is no God but He. وَاللَّهُ الْمُوَفِّقُ وَالْهَادِي لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا هُ. صلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. May Allah bless the Holy Prophet ﷺ, his family, his companions, and all of the scholars and ulama and awliya of this ummah, especially Imam Hafiz ibn Hajar al-Asqalani. May Allah reward him well for this book, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala benefit us with this knowledge, and may help us to convey it as we heard it, to put it into practice. As they told us, the practice of hadith is completely different from what we just did now. Talking about hadith, narrating even hadith, and relating hadith, memorizing it even, is not the same as putting it into practice. And the goal is to put it into practice. So let this be for us a support for our deen, not to be undermining us in our deen through pride or ostentation or conceit or anything like that. And inshallah, if we remember some of that, we don't claim to remember or to put it into practice, it will be good. To have added respect and to make tarahhum, rahimahumullah ajma'in, on those ulama, and to have greater respect for them and for what they are carrying and conveying. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make the Quran the light of our hearts, and the hadith of Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam the light of our hearts, and a healing for us and for the whole community and the ummah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to benefit ourselves and others. Bihurmati subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun wa salamun ala al-mursaleen walhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Al-Fatiha.